August 20th, 1942, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. The Japanese 17th Army's commanding general has just received a supply assessment that makes no operational sense, and he is beginning to understand that this war is not going to be decided by fighting. General Hyakutake Haruyoshi, commanding the Japanese 17th Army from his headquarters at Rabaul and responsible for retaking Guadalcanal from the American Marines who have held it since their landing on August 7th, is looking at figures he cannot reconcile with his understanding of what an expeditionary force can sustain at the end of a supply line crossing 600 miles of contested ocean. His own forces have been trying to supply their garrison on Guadalcanal for 13 days, running destroyer convoys down the channel that American forces have named the Slot, losing ships to American air attack from Henderson Field, landing supplies at night and withdrawing before dawn because daylight operations in American controlled waters produce losses that he cannot sustain for more than a few weeks at this rate. His intelligence assessments of what the American garrison on Guadalcanal is receiving, derived from aerial observation of supply vessel activity in Guadalcanal waters, from the reports of Japanese submarine commanders who have observed American cargo operations and attempted to interdict them, and from the assessment of the Imperial Japanese Navy's intelligence staff who are monitoring American radio traffic and attempting to reconstruct the volume and frequency of American supply deliveries from the patterns they observe, suggest that the Americans are not operating under the same constraints. They are not operating under any constraint that his intelligence apparatus can identify as recognizable from the doctrine of supply that his professional military education has provided. The constraint of shipping availability, the physical limit imposed by the number of cargo vessels that can be assembled, loaded, and dispatched to an operational area, appears to be inapplicable to what the Americans are doing because the numbers of vessels observed in Guadalcanal waters at any given time exceed what the Japanese intelligence assessment of American Pacific shipping allocation had projected would be available for this theater. The constraint of enemy interdiction, the degradation of supply delivery rates that enemy air and naval action produces against a convoy system operating within range of hostile forces, appears to be inapplicable to what the Americans are doing because the American supply deliveries continue at high rates despite Japanese air attacks from the airfields at Rabaul and the surface action that Japanese destroyers conduct against American supply shipping in the waters around Guadalcanal. The constraint of distance, the logistical friction that increases with every mile between the supply depot and the receiving force, appears to be inapplicable to what the Americans are doing in a way that defies the mathematical relationships between distance and supply efficiency that Japanese operational planning has incorporated as fundamental. American cargo ships are offloading through the surf at Guadalcanal in what appears, from the reports of Japanese aircraft that have observed the activity, to be continuous daylight operations at a volume that his own quartermaster staff, when asked to calculate what the observed vessel activity implies about the tonnage being delivered, produces a number that Hyakutake initially believes is a transcription error. It is not. The Americans are delivering to an island 600 miles from their nearest major base more supplies per day than his own forces at Rabaul, 40 miles from their primary supply hub, are receiving. His quartermaster's staff, when he asks for an explanation, can provide only the observation that no army they are aware of has ever attempted or achieved resupply at this scale, at this distance in active combat conditions. It is not, they say, consistent with what war allows. What they mean, and what Hyakutake understands them to mean, is that the American supply operation violates the basic assumptions of military logistics as they have been understood by every army that has ever operated in the Pacific or any other ocean, not merely doing something better than anyone else has done it, but doing something that the existing frameworks of military operational planning do not contain a category for, because the existing frameworks were built around constraints that the American operation appears not to recognize. The story of what Japanese commanders privately wrote about American logistics in the Pacific War is not a story about admiration, though admiration, the specific professional respect of one military for another's competence in a domain where competence is measurable and the measurement is unmistakable, is present in some of the accounts. It is primarily a story about the specific professional shock of trained military officers encountering a system that operates outside the boundaries that their professional training had identified as the governing constraints on military operations in the Pacific theater. The shock is documented not primarily in the communications that Japanese commanders intended to be read by their superiors. Those communications are consistently managed to avoid conveying the full implications of what the commanders are observing, because the full implications are implications about the war's eventual outcome that the command chain cannot publicly acknowledge, but in the personal diaries and the internal operational assessments that the commanders produce for their own analytical purposes, and that the post war record preserves through a combination of Japanese archive scholarship, captured operational documents, and the post war interrogation records that American military historians and the Strategic Bombing Survey team produce from their interviews with surviving Japanese commanders. These documents say what the official communications could not say, and what they say is consistent enough across multiple commanders in multiple theaters that the consistency itself is part of the evidence. The system they are describing is real. It operates in the same way in every theater they encounter it, and the conclusions they draw from it are essentially the same conclusions regardless of which commander is drawing them. Every professional military in 1942 understood logistics as the art of delivering enough material to enough men in enough time, under the specific constraints that ocean distance, weather, enemy interdiction, and the physical capacity of available shipping imposed. These constraints were real. They had been observed and quantified across decades of modern warfare. They set limits on what was achievable, and those limits were incorporated into military planning as the boundary conditions within which strategy had to operate. When an adversary appeared to operate without reference to those boundaries, when the observed American supply operation at Guadalcanal delivered tonnages at distances that Japanese logistics planning said required either three times the shipping the Americans appeared to have, or half the distance they were actually operating at. The professional military response was not merely to note the superiority, it was to question the foundational assumptions on which the planning had rested, because an adversary who is not operating within your assumed constraints is an adversary you cannot plan against effectively and cannot defeat within the framework you have been trained to apply. Hyakutake had been a general officer for 4 years when he arrived at Rabaul to command the 17th Army in May 1942. He was not an inexperienced or unintelligent man. His career had included command positions at multiple levels, staff assignments in the Japanese Army's most demanding positions, and the accumulated experience of an officer who had risen through a military establishment that took professional military education seriously and that produced, in its doctrine, its planning frameworks, its logistical assessment methods, a body of institutional knowledge that represented the collective experience of the Japanese Army's operational history. What his career had not given him, and what no career in the Japanese Army of 1942 could have given him, was a framework for what he was encountering at Guadalcanal. The American logistics operation at Guadalcanal was not a product of improvisation or of any single tactical innovation. It was the product of a specific institutional culture, operating with specific industrial resources that had been building toward this capability for decades. An American military logistics tradition that drew on the civilian distribution and transportation infrastructure of the largest economy in the world that had been professionalized and expanded through the build-up period of 1940 to 1942, and that was now being applied to Pacific Island. Resupply with a scale and efficiency that Japanese operational planning had not modeled because no previous Pacific military operation had demonstrated that such a thing was possible. The question Hyakutake is confronting in August 1942 is whether what he is seeing is an anomaly, a product of temporary American circumstances that will normalize as Japanese pressure is applied, or whether it reflects something structural about the American military industrial relationship that cannot be changed by any tactical pressure he can bring. The answer he reaches, confirmed and confirmed again by what happens over the following months on Guadalcanal and in subsequent Pacific campaigns, determines his understanding of the war's eventual outcome, an understanding that he cannot share with the men under his command or with the Japanese public, because sharing it accurately would require acknowledging conclusions that the military establishment and the government it serves are not prepared to have acknowledged, conclusions whose acknowledgment would require either a fundamental change in Japanese strategy or an honest conversation with the Japanese people about the likelihood of defeat that neither the military nor the civilian government is prepared to conduct. September 1942 through February 1943. The Guadalcanal campaign confirms, battle by battle and logistical assessment by logistical assessment, what Hyakutake's quartermaster staff had initially identified as a transcription error. The American supply operation at Guadalcanal is not an anomaly. It is a system, a specific and disciplined system that the American military has organized around the operational requirements of the Pacific Campaign with the same methodical attention to detail that the Japanese military brings to its tactical planning, and that produces month by month a supply advantage on Guadalcanal that tactical performance on the ground cannot overcome, regardless of the individual quality of Japanese infantry. The specific figures are documented in the post war operational analyses that American military historians compile from both American supply records and captured Japanese operational documents, cross referenced against the operational diaries of Japanese commanders, and the supply reports filed by the logistical branches of both the 17th Army and the 8th Area Army. American forces on Guadalcanal receive, at the peak of the campaign in November and December 1942, approximately 20,000 tons of supplies per month: food, ammunition, aviation fuel, medical supplies, construction materials, and the full logistical complement of a combined arms force conducting active offensive and defensive operations simultaneously. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal receive approximately 2,000 to 3,000 tons per month, and this figure represents the maximum achievable through the destroyer express supply runs that the Japanese Navy organizes specifically for the purpose of maximizing delivery while minimizing exposure to American air attack from Henderson Field, running at night and withdrawing before dawn, accepting the tactical risk to the destroyers involved and the operational risk to the broader naval balance in the area as the cost of maintaining any supply flow to the garrison at all. The destroyers that run the slot, the channel between New Georgia and Guadalcanal that American forces name for its geography and Japanese forces name in their operational planning documents by its tactical characteristics as a contested maritime corridor, carry supplies in drums lashed to their decks rather than in their cargo holds, because loading supplies in drums and throwing them overboard for the garrison to retrieve by swimming or small boat is faster than a formal unloading operation and reduces the time the destroyers spend in American air attack range. The drum supply method is not a choice. It is the adaptation of a military supply system that has encountered conditions it was not designed for and is doing the best that its constraints permit, which is to deliver 10% of what the Americans are delivering from supply routes that are more convenient, more heavily resourced, and operating under air cover that the Japanese system cannot provide its supply vessels. a specially adapted resupply method designed to minimize exposure to American air attack from Henderson Field, running at the maximum risk that the Navy considers sustainable for the ships it is committing. The 10-to-1 ratio in supply delivery is not a product of American technology superiority in any specific sense. It is a product of the American ability to organize and sustain a supply chain operation at a scale that the Japanese system cannot match, regardless of the tactical sacrifices the Japanese Navy makes to close the gap. The near failure in the American Guadalcanal supply operation, the moment that comes closest to demonstrating that the supply advantage is not inevitable and could be interdicted sufficiently to change the campaign's outcome, arrives in November 1942 when the naval battles of Guadalcanal produce, in 3 days of surface and air combat from November 13th to 15th, losses to both sides that the American supply operation cannot easily absorb. Admiral Halsey's South Pacific Command, committed to defending Guadalcanal's supply lines by Admiral Chester Nimitz's Pacific Command authority, and by the strategic imperative that losing Guadalcanal would represent for American Pacific strategy, loses the cruisers Juno and Atlanta, the destroyers Barton, Monson, and several others, and the light cruiser Northampton is damaged and eventually sinks, in exchange for the destruction of the Japanese troop convoy, attempting to deliver 7,000 troops and their supplies to the Guadalcanal garrison. The Japanese transport ships, hit by American air attack after the surface battle, allows them to continue toward Guadalcanal, beach themselves on the island's coast to allow their troops to disembark, but are then destroyed by further American air and surface attack before they can unload more than a fraction of their supplies. Approximately 4,000 Japanese soldiers reach Guadalcanal from the convoy, but they arrive without their supplies, which are burning on the beached transports or sunk in Guadalcanal Sound, and their arrival actually worsens the Japanese supply situation on the island by adding mouths that need feeding to a garrison that was already receiving insufficient food. The convoy, 11 transport ships carrying 7,000 troops and their supplies, is destroyed by American air attack and surface forces, but the losses in American naval assets in the 3 day engagement are severe enough that the American supply schedule for Guadalcanal is disrupted for approximately 2 weeks. The Japanese commanders at Rabaul, receiving the battle reports and the subsequent intelligence on American supply deliveries, interpret the 2 week disruption as evidence that sustained naval pressure on American supply lines can produce meaningful degradation, that the American supply system has vulnerabilities that, if consistently attacked, could change the balance on Guadalcanal. What they are seeing is not, in fact, evidence of vulnerability. It is a pause. The American supply deliveries resume on schedule 2 weeks after the November battle and continue at rates that the Japanese destroyer Express cannot match even with the ships it has not yet lost. The near failure validates the American system by showing that disruption is episodic and recovery is rapid, precisely the opposite of the conclusion the Japanese assessment draws from the same evidence. General Imamura Hitoshi, who commands the 8th Area Army responsible for the entire Solomon Islands and New Guinea operational area from November 1942, and who personally directs the final attempts to reinforce Guadalcanal before the February 1943 evacuation, writes the most detailed Japanese assessment of the American supply operation that survives in the post war record. His operational diary, portions of which are available to researchers through the Japanese National Institute for Defense Studies, and which have been excerpted and analyzed in the post war scholarship of military historians, including Saburo Hayashi, whose study of the Japanese Army's Pacific campaigns remains one of the most systematic analyses of Japanese operational decision making available in English, describes in specific operational language the progressive recognition that the supply differential at Guadalcanal is not a tactical problem for which tactical solutions are available, but a structural condition that Japanese operational capacity cannot address. In Mamura's diary, entries from November and December 1942, written while he is organizing the final Japanese attempts to reinforce Guadalcanal and beginning to assess the possibility that evacuation is the only operationally viable conclusion to the campaign, described the American supply operation with a professional precision that reflects years of experience in military logistics assessment and a specific analytical clarity that his command position, removed from the Guadalcanal garrison itself, enables. He can see the whole picture in a way that the commanders on the island, focused on the immediate demands of their tactical situation, cannot fully assemble. What he sees, assembling the intelligence reports and the supply assessments and the operational readiness reports of the Guadalcanal garrison, is a picture of an asymmetry so complete that no tactical solution available to the Japanese forces in the theater can address it. The American garrison is getting stronger week by week, while the Japanese garrison is getting weaker, not because of Japanese tactical failure, but because the supply differential is doing what supply differentials always do when they are this large and this persistent. It is translating directly into combat capability, into the artillery ammunition that allows American guns to fire more rounds than Japanese positions can absorb, into the aviation fuel that keeps Henderson Field's aircraft flying more sorties than Japanese air forces can contest, into the food and medical supplies that keep the American garrison operational while the Japanese garrison is managing malnutrition and disease at rates that are reducing its effective combat strength below what any tactical calculation requires. He identifies three specific elements of the American supply operation that he finds, in his diary's language, professionally inexplicable. The volume of shipping the Americans maintain in the operational area despite Japanese air and submarine attack, the speed with which they repair and restore operational capability to vessels damaged in combat, and the organizational capacity to maintain continuous supply operations across a 600-mile logistical chain while simultaneously conducting offensive combat operations on multiple axes. His diary entries on these subjects are written in the specific language of a professional military officer assessing an adversary's capability, precise about what is observed, careful about what is concluded, reluctant to state conclusions whose implications exceed what the immediate evidence fully supports. But the conclusions are there, stated or implied, and they add up to a picture that his subsequent operational decisions and the decisions of every Japanese commander in the Pacific in 1943 and beyond reflect. The American logistics system is not something that can be overcome by tactical excellence, and the war that this logistics system is supporting is not going to be won by an army whose own logistics system operates at 1/10 the scale. By October 1944, when American forces are landing on Leyte in the Philippines and the Japanese military is organizing its final strategic response, the supply differential that Hyakutake had identified at Guadalcanal in August 1942 has expanded rather than contracted. American logistics operations in the Central Pacific Campaign of 1943 and 1944, the assault on the Gilbert Islands in November 1943, the Marshall Islands in February 1944, the Mariana Islands in June and July 1944, have demonstrated at each successive operation that the American supply system's capability is not a fixed quantity, but a growing one, incorporating the lessons of each previous operation into improved procedures, expanded infrastructure, and refined organizational capacity that makes each successive operation more efficiently supplied than the one before it. The underway replenishment system, the development of specialized vessels that can refuel, rearm, and resupply warships at sea without returning to port, extending the operational range of the American fleet indefinitely across the Pacific, is identified in the captured Japanese operational assessments of 1944 as the single most confounding element of the American logistical capability, the element that most thoroughly violates the planning assumptions Japanese naval doctrine has applied to fleet operations. A fleet that cannot be compelled to return to port cannot be planned against in the ways that Japanese operational doctrine prescribes. The specific tactics of attrition and interdiction that are designed to degrade an enemy fleet's capability by forcing it to operate at the end of a fixed logistical tether, by attacking its supply lines, by threatening its home bases, by maintaining pressure that forces it to consume fuel and ammunition faster than it can replenish, have no application against a fleet that has no fixed tether. The American underway replenishment capability is not a technological breakthrough in any single component system. The tankers that refuel the carriers and battleships at sea are not more advanced than tankers that other navies operate. The supply vessels that transfer ammunition and provisions through suspended cables to warships steaming alongside them are not more sophisticated than the engineering of other nations' maritime supply systems. What is different is the organizational decision to build a fleet support infrastructure that prioritizes extended range operations over port based logistics, and the industrial investment required to build enough of these vessels to sustain an entire fleet at sea for weeks rather than days. The Service Force Pacific Fleet that Vice Admiral William Calhoun commands by 1944 comprises hundreds of vessels, tankers, ammunition ships, store ships, repair ships, hospital ships, the full logistical complement of a mobile floating base that follow the combat fleet wherever it goes and provide whatever it needs while it continues operating. The Japanese combined fleet has no equivalent. Its planning has assumed port based logistics because no other logistics system was within Japanese industrial capacity to build, and the assumption has remained unchallenged until it encounters an adversary who has made the opposite assumption and built the infrastructure to support it. The October 1944 assessment of the American logistical system produced by the Japanese Naval General Staff, portions of which are preserved in the captured operational documents held at the U.S. National Archives, describes the underway replenishment capability with a directness that the documents produced earlier in the war had avoided. It describes it as an operational capacity whose existence has made the maritime strategy Japan entered the war with inapplicable to the actual conditions of the war that Japan is fighting. The post war interrogations of Japanese generals and admirals conducted by American military intelligence in the months after Japan's surrender in August 1945 produced the most direct and most analytically complete statements that Japanese commanders make about American logistics. These interrogations, conducted by officers from the Operations Division of the War Department and from the Strategic Bombing Survey Team that is simultaneously attempting to assess the impact of American strategic bombing on Japanese production, provide a context in which surviving Japanese commanders can speak with a frankness that the wartime chain of command had made impossible. They are no longer officers managing the information their subordinates and the Japanese public receive. They are prisoners, or cooperating former enemies, speaking to questioners who have already seen the results of the war and who are asking not for propaganda but for professional military assessment. What they say, preserved in the interrogation transcripts at the National Archives and in the published volumes of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, is consistent across multiple commanders from multiple services and operational areas. That the American logistics system was the primary reason the Pacific War ended as it did, that the specific elements of American logistical capability that most exceeded Japanese planning assumptions were the scale of operations, the speed of recovery from damage, and the continuous adaptation of the system to operational requirements in ways that no Japanese equivalent demonstrated, and that the specific term inhuman, or its Japanese equivalents, Hitogoto ni Yoranai and Ningen Banare Shita, phrases that carry the connotation of something operating beyond human scale, rather than cruelty in the moral sense, appears in several of the accounts as the characterization that Japanese commanders found most accurate for a logistical operation that seemed to operate outside the human constraints that military logistics planning had always taken as given. The term, when Japanese commanders apply it to American logistics in these interrogation sessions, is a professional assessment rather than an emotional one. It is the language of men who understand that the word human, applied to military operations, means the constraints that human scale imposes on what any organization can build and sustain, and who are using the word inhuman to describe an operation that appears to have transcended those constraints, not through the violation of physical laws, which is impossible, but through the application of organizational capacity, industrial resources, and institutional priority that exceeds anything their experience or their doctrine had given them a category for. The American logistic system that the Japanese commanders encounter in the Pacific between 1942 and 1945 is not, by the judgment of any of the commanders who examine it in the interrogation sessions, a product of American intelligence or American courage or any quality of the individual Americans involved that is greater than the corresponding qualities of the Japanese men opposing them. It is a product of organization, of the specific decision to treat the supply of a fighting force as a strategic priority, to invest the resources that decision requires, and to build the institutional capacity that those resources can produce when they are given the organizational structures appropriate to the task. They meant, in most cases, not that the system was cruel, though the war it supported produced enormous cruelty, but that it exceeded human scale in the specific sense that the Guadalcanal quartermaster staff had first articulated in August 1942. It was not operating within the boundaries that human scale military organization, however well organized and however efficiently operated, had previously demonstrated as the achievable limits of logistical performance in the context of Pacific Island warfare. The American logistic system that produced these reactions was not a product of genius, it was a product of organization. The specific organizational capacity that made the American Pacific supply system what it was, the ability to coordinate the movement of millions of tons of material across thousands of miles of ocean, from factories and depots on the American continent, through staging areas in Hawaii and Australia, to operational areas in the Central and South Pacific, maintaining supply rates that increased rather than decreased as the operational area expanded, was the product of an institutional culture that had been building for decades, drawing on the civilian transportation and distribution infrastructure of the largest economy in the world, and applying it to military logistics with the specific institutional willingness to invest in logistics as a command function rather than an administrative one. The officers who ran American logistics in the Pacific, men like Lieutenant General Brahan Somervell, who, as commanding general of Army Service Forces, had redesigned the American Army's logistics system from the ground up between 1942 and 1944 in a reorganization whose scale and speed reflected the same industrial organizational capacity that was simultaneously rebuilding American shipyard output and aircraft production. Major General William D. Steyer, who commanded Army Service Forces in the Pacific and who translated Somervell's reorganized logistics system into the specific operational context of Pacific Island warfare, and Vice Admiral William Calhoun, commanding the Service Force Pacific Fleet, whose underway replenishment ships extended the fleet's operational reach beyond anything Japanese naval planning had projected as achievable, were given resources, authority, and institutional priority that the Japanese logistics systems commanders were not given, and that reflected a fundamental difference in how the two militaries understood the relationship between supply and combat power. The difference was not primarily technological. The specific vessels and techniques of the American logistics system were not beyond Japanese engineering capability. The difference was institutional. The American military treated logistics as a command function, whose operational importance was equivalent to the combat functions it supported, staffed the logistics function with officers of commensurate quality and authority, and invested the resources required to build the organizational capacity that this prioritization implied. The Japanese military treated logistics as an administrative function subordinate to the combat arms, staffed accordingly, and invested correspondingly less, producing a logistics system whose ceiling of achievable performance was set by the institutional priority given to the function rather than by Japanese industrial capacity or Japanese professional expertise. Japanese military culture had consistently prioritized combat arms over support branches, producing a military in which the logistics function was understaffed, underfunded, and institutionally subordinate in ways that limited its capacity to solve the supply problems that the Pacific Campaign produced. American military culture had, through the specific organizational decisions made by General George Marshall as Army Chief of Staff and Admiral Ernest King as Chief of Naval Operations in 1941 and 1942, invested in logistics as a command priority in a way that produced, over 2 years of Pacific operations, the system that Japanese commanders found in their private writing to be operating outside the laws that govern what human military organizations can achieve. Hyakutake's private understanding of what the American logistics operation represented, developed in August 1942 through his quartermaster staff's initial incomprehension, and refined through the 6 months of Guadalcanal fighting that confirmed and extended every initial observation, is the understanding that every subsequent Japanese commander who faces American logistical capability in the Pacific reaches independently through their own encounter with the same system in their own theater and describes in their own operational assessments and diaries and post war testimony in nearly identical terms. The supply rates are impossible. The recovery speeds are impossible. The organizational scale is impossible, and yet it is happening in real ships carrying real tonnages to real islands where real American soldiers and Marines are eating and fighting and being resupplied at rates that no Japanese force in the Pacific can match, regardless of the tactical sacrifices made to approach parity. The word impossible, applied by professional military officers to something that is demonstrably occurring, is the word of a planning framework encountering something that exists outside its boundaries. And the Japanese planning framework, however sophisticated and however well developed in the areas of tactical doctrine and operational planning, had not been built with boundaries wide enough to accommodate what the American logistics system was doing in the Pacific between 1942 and 1945. Understanding this is not optional for understanding why the war ended when and how it did. The battles were the expression of the logistics. The logistics were the expression of the industrial capacity behind them, and the industrial capacity was the expression of an institutional decision made in Washington in 1940 and 1941 to treat the supply of a fighting force as a strategic priority equivalent to the combat forces it supplied, a decision whose consequences showed up in the supply assessments of every Japanese general who tried to plan against it and found that his planning framework did not contain a number large enough to describe what he was facing.